I am Arya, and I am 34 years old. Exactly 3 months ago, a single, incredibly cruel sentence spoken by my own mother at a crowded family picnic changed the trajectory of my life forever. While my sweet, innocent 6-year-old son was quietly sitting at the table, my mother looked me dead in the eye across the potato salad and said, "Next time, don't bring the kid." She smiled while she said it, deliberately trying to humiliate me and my little boy in front of 23 members of our extended family. But there is one massive detail she did not know. I was already holding a secret real estate document, a legally binding contract that proved I owned the very ground she stood on. And right now, she is the one desperately begging for a roof over her head. Before I tell you exactly how I dismantled her perfect, fake life, hit that like button if you believe in justice. And please, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Now, let's go back to where this nightmare finally boiled over. It was the 4th of July weekend. My aunt had organized this massive family barbecue at Eastwood Metropark. It was one of those sweltering Ohio afternoons where the humidity hangs in the air and the smell of charcoal and cheap sunscreen coats everything. There were 23 adults gathered around a long line of picnic tables. Kids were running everywhere. My son, Leo, who is 6 years old, missing his 2 front teeth, and absolutely obsessed with dinosaurs, was being an absolute angel. He had shared his juice box with a toddler he didn't even know. He had scraped his knee on the concrete, didn't shed a single tear, and just asked me for a dinosaur bandage. But my mother, Evelyn, had been watching him all afternoon with this deep, sour scowl on her face. You know the look. It is the look of someone who has just bitten into a rotten lemon. Every time my sweet boy ran past her lawn chair, she would let out this heavy, dramatic sigh. Then, it was time for dinner. We were all crammed onto those wooden benches. Leo was sitting next to my 13-year-old daughter, Maya. He was just swinging his little legs because they couldn't reach the ground, and he had a tiny smudge of ketchup on his chin. He was doing nothing wrong. He was just existing. Out of nowhere, the casual chatter died down. My mother put her plastic fork down on her paper plate. She folded her hands together, leaned forward, and delivered the line that shattered our family. "Arya," she said, her voice carrying over the music, "next time, maybe just don't bring the kid. It would be easier for everyone." The silence that crashed down on that park pavilion was deafening. It was so thick you could physically choke on it. I looked around the table, desperately waiting for someone, anyone, to speak up. My aunt looked down at her baked beans. My uncle suddenly became entirely fascinated by his corn on the cob. And my dad, Arthur? The man who was supposed to protect me? He just took a slow sip of his beer and stared up at the sky, actively pretending he didn't hear his own wife publicly degrade his grandson. No one defended my son. I felt the blood drain from my face. I opened my mouth, fully prepared to do what I had done my entire life, swallow my pride, offer a weak apology, and keep the peace. But before a single syllable could leave my throat, Maya put her burger down. My 13-year-old daughter wiped her hands on a napkin, pushed her chair back against the concrete, and stood straight up. She looked directly into my mother's eyes, her voice completely steady, and said, "Say that again." My mother let out a scoff, a dismissive little laugh. She looked at me and sneered, "This is what happens when you don't teach your children respect." I looked at Leo, who was staring up at me with tears welling in his brown eyes, and I felt a tectonic shift in my soul. I did not yell. I looked at Evelyn and said, "Leo is your grandson. If you cannot treat him like family, then I have absolutely no reason to keep treating you like mine." I grabbed my purse, took my children by their hands, and walked away from the table. To truly understand the weight of what happened at that picnic, you have to understand the toxic machinery of my family, and exactly how I had been used to keep it running. For years, I was the one who held everything together, and I did it with my hard-earned salary. I was the family ATM, the reliable scapegoat whose only value was her checkbook. I am a dental hygienist, and I work administrative shifts at a walk-in clinic on the weekends. I am not wealthy, but I work relentlessly. While I was working double shifts just to pay off my student loans, my older sister, Chloe, was living a life of absolute luxury. Chloe is the golden child. She was the one who received the massive, fully funded college fund. She was the one whose minor promotion at some vague marketing firm was celebrated with expensive champagne dinners at country clubs. I, on the other hand, was expected to be the financial safety net for my parents so they could continue funding Chloe's extravagant lifestyle. 2 winters ago, when my parents' furnace completely broke down in the middle of January, who sent the $1,200 wire transfer so they wouldn't freeze? I did. When my dad needed new tires for his truck and they were miraculously behind on their auto insurance, who paid the bill directly to the mechanic? I did. When Evelyn wanted to throw herself an incredibly lavish birthday dinner at an upscale steakhouse and then conveniently forgot her designer wallet in her other purse, who handed the waiter their debit card? I did. I never complained. I never asked for a dime back. I genuinely believed that this was simply what family did. You help your people, and you trust that when you fall, they will be there to catch you. But they never caught me. The hypocrisy was a bitter pill that I swallowed every single day. Let me give you the perfect example. Several months before the picnic, I had an out-of-town volleyball tournament for Maya. I desperately needed someone to watch Leo from Saturday morning to Sunday afternoon. I called my mother, begging her for this one tiny favor. She sighed heavily into the receiver and told me she was simply too exhausted and couldn't possibly handle a 6-year-old. Leo is the easiest child on the planet. He goes to bed at 8:30 without a single complaint. But she was too tired. That Sunday night, sitting in a cheap motel room, I opened Facebook. There, splashed across my newsfeed, were 50 photos of Evelyn hosting an elaborate cocktail party at her house that exact same weekend. She had invited 6 of her socialite friends. She made 3 different kinds of artisan dips. She wore a silk blouse and drank margaritas until midnight. She was too exhausted for her own grandson, but she had endless energy for her country club friends. My cousin Clara was the only person in the entire bloodline who saw the reality of the situation. Clara would sit with me on my porch, watching me cry out of sheer exhaustion, and she would tell me, "Aria, you are writing checks for people who would not give you a glass of water if you were on fire." She saw how Evelyn treated me, and it made her sick. But for 34 years, I ignored Clara's warnings. I kept giving, kept paying, kept sacrificing my own peace because I was desperately chasing a mother's love that did not exist. I thought if I just proved my worth through my wallet, I would finally belong. That picnic shattered the illusion forever. The drive home from the park that evening felt like it took a lifetime. The interior of my car was completely silent except for the hum of the tires on the asphalt. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Maya was sitting in the passenger seat, staring blankly out the window, her jaw clenched so tight I thought her teeth might crack. In the back seat, Leo had fallen fast asleep. His mouth was slightly open, and he was still tightly clutching the little plastic triceratops I had bought him at the dollar store. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned a stark white. My mother's voice kept playing on a continuous loop in my mind. "Next time, don't bring the kid." It echoed in my skull like a poison. When I finally pulled into my small, cracked driveway, I put the car in park, but I didn't turn off the engine. I just sat there in the dark, watching the headlights illuminate the garage door, feeling a hollow pit open up in my stomach. How many times had I driven home from a family event feeling exactly like this? The answer was every single time. After I gently carried Leo to his bed and made sure Maya was okay, I went out to the back porch and dialed Clara's number. She answered on the very first ring. I didn't even say hello, I just started crying. I told her every single grueling detail. I told her about the potato salad, the horrible quote, the sickening silence of 23 adults, and the incredible bravery of my teenage daughter. When I finally finished gasping for air, Clara didn't offer empty platitudes. She was furious. She told me that I had officially served my time as the family punching bag, and she demanded to know when I was going to pack up my dignity and walk away. Sitting there in the humid night air, smelling the faint scent of charcoal still clinging to my hair, I made a vow. I told Clara, I am done. Starting tonight, the bank is permanently closed. I knew Evelyn wouldn't reach out to apologize. That would require her to possess a conscience. The first real test of my new vow arrived exactly 9 days later. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, and Evelyn's name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath, braced myself, and answered. She didn't ask about Leo. She didn't mention the picnic. Instead, she launched right into her classic, heavily rehearsed script. She told me, in this incredibly dramatic, frail voice, that the hot water heater in their basement was making a terrifying noise. She said my dad was worried it was going to burst and flood the house. Then came the ultimate manipulation tactic. She didn't ask for the money directly, she just laid the bait. She let out a long, trembling sigh and said, I just don't know what we're going to do, Arya. Your father's hours got cut, and with my medical bills. I just don't know. It was the heavy, loaded silence that followed, the pause where I was always supposed to jump in and say, Don't worry Mom, I'll call a plumber and give them my credit card number. I felt the old, familiar panic rise in my chest. The conditioning of 34 years screamed at me to fix it. But then I pictured Leo's tearful eyes at the picnic table. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, forced my voice to remain completely steady, and said, Wow, that sounds really stressful, Mom. I really hope you and Dad figure it out. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. It was so prolonged, so deeply shocked, that I actually pulled the phone away from my ear to check if the call had dropped. It hadn't. She was just completely short-circuiting. She had no idea how to process a version of her daughter that didn't immediately bleed money on command. I didn't wait for her to recover. I simply said goodbye and hung up. My hands were shaking, but for the first time in my life, I felt like I could finally breathe. Once Evelyn realized the financial well had completely dried up, the punishment began. If she couldn't control me with guilt, she was going to destroy my reputation. But even as the family started to turn their backs on me, I thought I could shield my children from the fallout. I was so incredibly wrong. About 3 weeks after the picnic, the reality of my mother's cruelty hit my home in the most devastating way possible. I was standing in the kitchen browning ground beef for tacos. Leo came shuffling into the room after getting off the school bus. He dropped his little dinosaur backpack on the floor and climbed up onto one of the bar stools. I could tell immediately that something was weighing heavily on his mind. He was doing that thing little kids do where they open and close their mouth like a fish, trying to find the brave words. I turned the stove down and asked him how his day was. He looked down at his swinging feet, then looked up at me with an expression of pure, unfiltered heartbreak. Mama, he whispered, am I bad? I dropped the spatula. It hit the counter with a loud clatter. I walked over, knelt down so I was eye level with him, and grabbed his little hands. Leo, why would you ever ask me something like that? I asked, my voice trembling. A tear rolled down his chubby cheek as he replied, because Grandma doesn't like me. She didn't want me at the party. So maybe I'm a bad boy. It felt like someone had driven a physical knife directly into my chest. My sweet, innocent 6-year-old boy, a child who literally draws pictures of rainbows for his teachers and apologizes when he bumps into inanimate objects, was sitting in my kitchen, genuinely trying to figure out what deep character flaw he possessed that made his own grandmother despise him. He was internalizing her toxicity. I pulled him into my arms and held him so fiercely I thought I might break him. I buried my face in his shoulder and told him, with every ounce of conviction in my soul, listen to me, Leo. You are perfect. You are the kindest, most wonderful boy in the world. Sometimes, grown-ups have ugliness inside their own hearts, and they say mean things because they are broken. It has absolutely nothing to do with you. I made him his favorite dinner, let him watch an extra episode of his favorite cartoon, and waited until he was sound asleep. Then, I walked into my master bathroom. I locked the door, sank down onto the cold tile floor, turned on the shower to muffle the sound, and I sobbed until I was physically gasping for air. The pain of being rejected by my mother was one thing. Watching her inflict that exact same trauma onto my child was unforgivable. The next morning, the sadness evaporated, leaving behind a cold, hardened fury. I picked up my phone and dialed Evelyn's number. When she answered, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I laid out a non-negotiable ultimatum. I told her, I am not attending another Sunday dinner. I am not coming to Thanksgiving. And I am not sending you another dime to fix your house or pay your bills until you drive to my house, look Leo in the eye, and give him a sincere apology. Do you know what this woman said to me? She scoffed loudly into the phone. You are going to punish your own mother over a joke? I was joking, Arya. You have always been far too emotional and sensitive. I felt the ice freeze in my veins. My son is questioning if he is a bad person, I replied, my voice dangerously low. If it was just a joke, it should be incredibly easy for you to apologize for it. She slammed the phone down and hung up on me. That was the exact moment the Cold War turned entirely nuclear. Evelyn, having failed to break my boundaries, immediately deployed her flying monkeys. She is a master manipulator who never fights her own battles when she can recruit a self-righteous army to do it for her. Within 48 hours, my phone became a toxic wasteland of guilt trips and blatant character assassination. First came Aunt Martha. Aunt Martha is Evelyn's younger sister, a woman who considers herself the moral compass of the family despite having 3 divorces under her belt. She left me a voicemail that I still have saved on my phone. She said, Arya, I just got off the phone with your mother, and she is in absolute tears. I cannot believe you would abandon your parents when they are struggling financially. Family helps family. You are being incredibly selfish, and frankly, I am disgusted by your behavior. It was infuriating. Aunt Martha had never paid a single utility bill for my parents, yet she felt perfectly entitled to demand my salary. Then came Uncle Vance. He didn't even have the courage to call. He just sent me a text message at 6 in the morning that read, Family first, Arya. Stop holding grudges. You're breaking your mother's heart. And then, of course, there was Chloe. My golden child sister didn't contact me directly. Instead, she took to social media. She posted a long, dramatic status update talking about forgiveness and toxic siblings, acting as if she were mourning a death. They were all treating me like a pariah, acting as if they were organizing my funeral while I was still alive and breathing. They framed me as a greedy, ungrateful monster who was letting her poor, elderly parents starve. There were days when the pressure was so intense I wanted to cave. The urge to just write a check, apologize for being too sensitive, and make the awful phone call stop was like a physical withdrawal symptom. But every time I looked at Leo playing on the living rug, the resolve hardened in my chest again. I instituted a strict policy of absolute silence. I did not argue with Aunt Martha. I did not reply to Uncle Vance. I certainly did not engage with Chloe's ridiculous internet poetry. Instead, I became a meticulous archivist. Every abusive voicemail was backed up to a cloud drive. Every manipulative text message was screenshot and categorized. I didn't know exactly what I was preparing for yet, maybe a lawsuit for harassment, maybe a custody battle over public opinion, but I knew that if the day ever came where I had to defend my sanity in a court of law or a court of family opinion, I was going to have an impenetrable fortress of evidence. I let them think they were winning. I let them feel powerful. Evelyn's rage at being ignored finally pushed her to cross the one line you never, ever cross with a mother. Realizing that the flying monkeys weren't breaking my spirit, she decided to infiltrate my home through the back door. It was a Tuesday afternoon, about 5 weeks after the explosive picnic. Maya came home from middle school, dumped her backpack in the hallway, and walked into the kitchen. I could tell immediately that her energy was off. She wasn't her usual chatty self. She sat at the island, picked up her phone, stared at the screen with her eyebrows furrowed, and then slammed it face down on the granite countertop. I asked her what was wrong, offering to help with homework or order pizza. She just shook her head and retreated to her bedroom. I gave her space, assuming it was middle school drama. But later that night, after Leo was asleep, I was sitting in the living room folding laundry when Maya appeared in the doorway. She had her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She walked over, handed me her phone, and said, "Mom, I need to show you something, and I need you to promise you won't freak out." I looked down at the glowing screen. It was an iMessage thread. The contact name was an unsaved number, but the words were unmistakably Evelyn's. My mother had somehow gotten Maya's cell phone number, likely from Aunt Martha, and had been secretly texting my 13-year-old daughter for 3 days. The messages were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. They started off innocent enough: "Hi sweetheart, Grandma misses you so much." But then, the poison seeped in. Evelyn wrote, "I wish your mom would let me see you guys. Your mom has always been very emotional and difficult. Even when she was your age, she would overreact to everything and cause drama. She needs help. Maybe you could talk some sense into her for me?" My blood turned to absolute ice. My mother was actively trying to recruit my teenage daughter to act as her double agent. She was trying to convince a child that her own mother was mentally unstable. She was pouring toxic waste directly into my daughter's brain, trying to destroy our bond. And notice what was completely missing from those texts. Not once did Evelyn ask how Leo was doing. My hand shook with rage, but before I could speak, Maya pointed at the screen. "Look at what I sent back," she said quietly. I scrolled down. My brave, brilliant 13-year-old girl hadn't just ignored the messages. She had responded. Maya wrote, "My mom is not emotional. She's just completely done pretending everything is fine when it isn't. And I am not going to ask my mom to forgive someone who hasn't even apologized to my little brother." I stared at the phone, completely in awe of the human being standing in front of me. I stood up, wrapped my arms around her, and told her she was the strongest person I knew. I immediately took screenshots of every single message in that thread and emailed them to myself. Evelyn thought she was playing chess, but she had just handed me the exact weapon I needed. The universe has a strange way of handing you the keys to your salvation right when you need them most. While Evelyn was busy trying to brainwash my daughter, I was about to stumble upon a secret that would shift the entire balance of power in our family. At the medical clinic where I work administration on the weekends, one of our regular patients was a man named Mr. Sterling. He was a sharp, impeccably dressed man in his late 50s who happened to be a highly successful real estate and estate planning lawyer. We had developed a friendly rapport over the years. One morning, while I was helping him with some complex insurance billing, I casually asked him a hypothetical question about protecting assets and dealing with toxic family members who were financially draining. Mr. Sterling looked at me over his reading glasses, sensing the exhaustion in my voice. He invited me to sit down in the break room for a cup of coffee. I ended up telling him a sanitized version of my situation: the constant demands for money, the smear campaign, the feeling of being trapped. Out of professional curiosity, and a genuine desire to help, he offered to run a quiet, perfectly legal public records check on my parents' property to see if they were actually in the financial distress they claimed to be in. 3 days later, I sat in Mr. Sterling's plush downtown office. He slid a manila folder across his heavy mahogany desk. What was inside those documents completely shattered the illusion my family had built for decades. My parents weren't just struggling with a broken water heater, they were drowning in an ocean of debt. The documents revealed that Chloe, the flawless golden child with her supposedly booming marketing business and luxury lifestyle, had been secretly bleeding my parents dry. She had convinced Arthur and Evelyn to co-sign massive business loans that she subsequently defaulted on. When that money vanished, my parents had quietly taken out a massive second mortgage on their family home, the home I grew up in, just to keep Chloe from declaring public bankruptcy and ruining her precious image. But the most shocking revelation was the current status of that mortgage. Because I had stopped acting as their ATM for the past 2 months, my parents had missed 3 consecutive mortgage payments. The bank had officially initiated pre-foreclosure proceedings. The debt was being packaged and sold off to a private collection agency. I sat in that leather chair, staring at the numbers, feeling a terrifying mix of vindication and horror. The sheer hypocrisy of it all was staggering. Evelyn had been lecturing me about family loyalty, calling me a selfish monster to anyone who would listen, all while she was literally weeks away from losing the roof over her head because she couldn't stop funding Chloe's fake, glamorous life. They thought I was just an emotional, angry daughter holding a petty grudge. They had no idea I was sitting in a lawyer's office, staring at the exact blueprint of their financial ruin. Mr. Sterling leaned back in his chair, steepled his fingers, and looked at me. "Arya," he said quietly, "you have a very unique opportunity here. The agency that bought this distressed debt is looking to offload it quickly. They want cash." I had a secret of my own. For years, I had been aggressively saving every extra penny I made. Part of it was an old college fund that my grandmother had left me, money Evelyn had tried to take, but legally couldn't touch. I combined that with the savings from my double shifts and my recent salary promotion. It was a substantial amount of money, a nest egg I had guarded with my life to protect Maya and Leo's future. Mr. Sterling laid out a strategy that was brilliantly, breathtakingly ruthless. Through a blind trust, an irrevocable legal entity managed by his firm, I could purchase the deed of trust on my parents' second mortgage. It was a completely legal, standard real estate transaction, and because it was done through the trust, my name would not appear on any public notices sent to the house. I didn't even hesitate. I signed the authorization papers right there on his desk. Within a week, the funds were transferred. By the time the ink dried on the final contracts, the bank no longer owned my parents' debt. The aggressive collection agency no longer owned it. I did. I was the sole beneficiary of the trust that held the legal rights to the property. If they defaulted, which they already had, I had the absolute legal authority to foreclose, evict them, and take possession of the home. I was, for all intents and purposes, their landlord. I walked out of Mr. Sterling's office holding a certified copy of the deed in my purse. I felt like I was vibrating with electric power. I didn't say a word to anyone. I didn't call Evelyn to gloat. I didn't text Chloe to mock her fake business. I went home, locked the documents in a fireproof safe in my closet, and went back to my normal life. I packed lunches for Leo. I drove Maya to her volleyball games. I let Evelyn continue her vicious smear campaign. I let Aunt Martha gossip to the church choir. I let Chloe parade around town in the luxury SUV that my parents had essentially traded their home to pay for. I let them build their house of cards as high as they possibly could. I knew that Thanksgiving was rapidly approaching. Evelyn, desperate to maintain her facade of wealth and control, was insisting on hosting the massive holiday dinner at the family home. She had invited everyone, Aunt Martha, Uncle Vance, and all the flying monkeys who had tormented me. She thought she was setting the stage to publicly break me, to force me into submission surrounded by the family she controlled. She thought she was luring me into a trap. But as I looked at the calendar, a cold, serene smile spread across my face. I was going to walk into that Thanksgiving dinner not as the scapegoat, but as the owner of the house. The storm was finally here, and I was the one holding the lightning. 3 months had passed since the explosive 4th of July picnic, and the autumn leaves had turned a crisp, burning orange across Ohio. The silence between my mother and me had been absolute, but I knew the storm was finally going to break on Thanksgiving. Evelyn, completely desperate to maintain her carefully constructed facade of generational wealth and perfect family harmony, insisted on hosting the massive holiday dinner at the family estate. It was the very same house she was secretly 3 months behind on paying for. She had sent out elegant, embossed invitations to everyone, Aunt Martha, Uncle Vance, Cousin Chloe, and all the flying monkeys who had spent the last 90 days treating me like a traitor. I knew exactly what this was. It was a calculated ambush. She wanted me surrounded by her loyal subjects so she could force me into a public submission. I decided to attend, but I did not bring Maya or Leo. I dropped them off at my cousin Clara's house for the afternoon. I was not going to let my children be used as emotional leverage or collateral damage in the psychological warfare that was about to unfold. I drove to my parents' house alone. When I pulled up to the curb, the first thing I noticed was Chloe's brand new, gleaming Porsche parked right in the center of the driveway. It was a staggering monument to their financial delusion. My parents were literally facing imminent foreclosure, their credit was completely destroyed, and yet Chloe was parading around in a luxury sports car funded by their ruined retirement accounts. I grabbed my purse. Inside, resting against my wallet, was the thick manila folder containing the certified real estate documents and the irrevocable deed of trust drafted by my lawyer. I took a deep breath of the freezing November air, squared my shoulders, and walked up the front steps. When I opened the heavy oak door, the smell of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and expensive wine hit me like a physical wall. The house was decorated to absolute perfection. There were crystal centerpieces on the dining table, fine china laid out, and a roaring fire in the massive stone fireplace. It was a breathtaking theatrical set designed to hide a terrifying financial reality. The moment I stepped into the foyer, the casual, loud chatter of 20 relatives abruptly died down. It was exactly like the silence at the picnic, but this time it was laced with heavy judgment. Aunt Martha, holding a glass of Chardonnay, gave me a tight, incredibly fake smile that didn't reach her eyes. Uncle Vance gave a dismissive nod and immediately turned his back to me. Chloe was standing near the kitchen island, wearing a designer silk dress, holding a glass of champagne, and looking at me with absolute, unfiltered pity. They all thought I was the broken, emotional outcast crawling back to beg for forgiveness. They thought I was terrified of losing my place in the family hierarchy. Evelyn emerged from the kitchen wearing an immaculate cashmere sweater and a string of pearls. She didn't hug me. She didn't ask where her grandchildren were. She simply looked me up and down, gave a highly patronizing sigh, and said, "Aria, I am so glad you finally decided to act like an adult and join us. We have a lot to discuss later." I didn't flinch. I didn't offer an apology. I just looked directly into her eyes, offered a polite, completely detached smile, and said, "Happy Thanksgiving, Mother. I wouldn't have missed this dinner for the entire world." I walked past her, poured myself a glass of sparkling water, and took a seat in the corner of the living room. I sat there quietly, watching them perform their incredibly fake lives, knowing that with one single piece of paper in my purse, I could legally evict every single one of them. The tension in the room was pulled as tight as a piano wire, and I was just waiting for Evelyn to hand me the scissors. Dinner was an agonizing marathon of passive-aggressive comments and thinly veiled insults. We all sat around the massive mahogany dining table, surrounded by the expensive silver cutlery that my parents had likely purchased on a maxed-out credit card. Aunt Martha kept making pointed remarks about how some people in the current generation have absolutely no respect for the sacrifices their elders made. Chloe spent 20 minutes loudly bragging about a massive new marketing contract her supposedly booming firm had just landed, talking about expanding her business and buying a second vacation property. I just quietly chewed my turkey, maintaining a completely neutral expression, letting them dig the hole as deep as they possibly could. When the dessert plates were finally cleared, Evelyn stood up at the head of the table. She tapped her crystal wine glass with a silver spoon, demanding everyone's immediate attention. The room fell entirely silent. She put on her most solemn, deeply wounded expression. This was it. The main event. The ambush she had been planning for 3 months. "Thanksgiving is a time for family," Evelyn began, her voice trembling with perfectly rehearsed emotion. "It is a time to put aside our petty differences, to forgive past mistakes, and to remember who truly matters. As the matriarch of this family, it has deeply broken my heart to see the division that has occurred recently." She turned her gaze directly onto me, pinning me to my chair under the heavy stares of 20 relatives. "Aria, you have caused this family an incredible amount of pain over the last few months. You threw a massive tantrum over a simple joke at a picnic, and you abandoned your father and me when we needed you the most." Aunt Martha nodded vigorously in agreement. Uncle Vance crossed his arms. I remained completely still, my hands resting calmly in my lap. Evelyn took a step closer to my side of the table. "But I am a forgiving mother," she continued, raising her chin. "I am willing to let you back into this family. However, there are conditions. You need to publicly apologize to me, right here and now, for your incredibly disrespectful behavior. Furthermore, your sister Chloe is at a critical juncture in her business. She needs a temporary financial bridge to secure her new expansion. Your father and I have already done our part. To prove your loyalty to this family, and to ensure you remain in our will and keep your inheritance, I expect you to write a check tonight from your savings to help your sister. If you cannot do that, if you cannot be a supportive sister and a respectful daughter, then you can pack your things, walk out that front door, and consider yourself entirely removed from this family forever." The audacity of her demand actually took my breath away. She wasn't just asking for a broken water heater anymore. She was demanding my entire life savings, the money I had bled for, the college fund I had protected for my children, just to fund Chloe's fake empire. She was threatening to cut off my inheritance, an inheritance that literally did not exist because they were entirely bankrupt. She thought she had me cornered. She thought the peer pressure of the entire extended family would crush me into total submission. She looked down at me, a smug, victorious smile playing on her lips, fully expecting me to burst into tears and pull out my checkbook. I slowly wiped my mouth with my linen napkin, pushed my chair back from the table, and stood up. I looked around the room at the sea of judging faces. I didn't feel fear. I didn't feel sadness. I felt the cold, hard steel of absolute justice rushing through my veins. "Mother," I said, my voice cutting through the silent dining room like a perfectly sharpened blade, "I am not going to apologize to you. I am not going to write Chloe a single check. And I am certainly not going to walk out that front door. Because before anyone leaves, I have a short presentation I would like to share with the family." I walked calmly over to the massive, 70-inch smart TV mounted on the living room wall just behind the dining table. My hands did not shake. My breathing was completely even. I pulled my smartphone out of my pocket, tapped the screen mirroring icon, and instantly connected my device to the television. The screen flashed bright blue, illuminating the shocked, confused faces of my relatives in the dim dining room. "You have all spent the last 3 months calling me a monster," I said, projecting my voice clearly so that even the relatives in the back row could hear every single syllable. "You left me voicemails calling me selfish. You sent me texts telling me I was tearing this family apart. Evelyn told you all that I was keeping her grandchildren away from her out of pure, emotional spite. She told you I was unstable." I tapped the screen of my phone. "Let me show you exactly what stability looks like." A massive, high-definition screenshot appeared on the television. It was the text message thread between Evelyn and my 13-year-old daughter, Maya. The font was blown up so large that no one in the room could possibly miss a single word. I began reading the texts out loud, my voice echoing off the hardwood floors. "Hi, sweetheart. I wish your mom would let me see you guys. Your mom has always been very emotional and difficult. Even when she was your age, she would overreact to everything and cause drama. She needs help. Maybe you could talk some sense into her for me?" A collective, audible gasp rippled through the dining room. Aunt Martha's hand flew up to cover her mouth. The smug, victorious smile completely vanished from Evelyn's face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. She lunged forward, nearly knocking over her crystal wine glass. "Turn that off," she shrieked, her voice cracking in terror. "Arya, turn that television off right now." "No," I replied sharply, holding my ground. I swiped to the next screenshot. "Let's read the next one, shall we? Where you explicitly tell my teenage daughter not to tell me you were contacting her. Where you actively tried to alienate a child from her own mother to serve your twisted need for control. And let's not forget this little gem down here. I pointed to the bottom of the screen. Where you told Maya that Aunt Martha is just a useful idiot who believes whatever you tell her. Aunt Martha's head snapped toward Evelyn, her eyes wide with absolute fury. You called me what? Martha hissed, her face turning a deep, violently angry shade of red. The entire facade of the perfect, united family completely shattered in less than 60 seconds. The room erupted into chaotic whispers. Uncle Vance looked at Evelyn with absolute disgust. They were finally seeing the monster hiding behind the cashmere and the pearls. They were seeing the psychological warfare she was willing to wage against a young girl. Evelyn was hyperventilating. Her chest was heaving, and she pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at my face. How dare you, she screamed, abandoning any pretense of elegance or grace. How dare you come into my house, eat my food, and disrespect me like this? You are a lying, ungrateful wretch. I want you out. Get out of my house right this second before I call the police and have you physically removed for trespassing. I stood entirely still in the center of the room. I let her scream. I let her threaten me with the police. I let her play her final, desperate card of authority. Then, I reached into my leather purse and slowly pulled out the thick, heavy manila folder. I held it up in the air, letting the silence command the room once more. Call the police, Evelyn, I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm whisper. I would absolutely love it if you called the police. Because when they get here, I am going to show them exactly who is trespassing. I walked back to the dining table and slammed the manila folder down on the polished mahogany wood. The loud smack echoed like a gunshot. I opened the flap and pulled out the crisp, legally binding documents drafted by Mr. Sterling. I tossed a copy directly in front of Evelyn, another copy in front of my father, Arthur, and slid a third copy down the table toward Chloe. You don't own this house, Evelyn, I stated, the words hanging in the air like a death sentence. You haven't owned this house for months. Evelyn stared down at the paperwork, her eyes scanning the bold legal letterhead. Her hands started to tremble violently. What is this? She whispered, her voice completely devoid of air. What did you do? I did what I always do, I replied, looking down at her with absolute, freezing contempt. I cleaned up your mess. But this time I didn't do it for free. You and Dad took out a massive second mortgage on this property to fund Chloe's absolutely fraudulent lifestyle. You drained your retirement accounts. You maxed out your credit. And when you ran out of money, you defaulted. You are 3 months behind on your mortgage payments. The bank initiated foreclosure proceedings. Your debt was sold to a private collection agency. I turned my gaze to Chloe, who was sitting frozen in her chair, the color completely drained from her face. There is no marketing firm, is there, Chloe? I asked, exposing her directly to the entire family. There are no massive contracts. There is just a mountain of debt, a leased Porsche you can't afford, and 2 elderly parents you completely bankrupted to maintain your pathetic illusion of success. Chloe opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. She just stared at the table, tears of profound humiliation welling in her eyes. The relatives who had been praising her success 20 minutes earlier were now staring at her like she was a criminal. I turned back to Evelyn. When the collection agency prepared to foreclose, I stepped in. I took my life savings, the college fund you couldn't touch, and the salary I earned working double shifts while you were throwing country club parties. Through an irrevocable blind trust, I purchased the deed of trust to this property. I leaned over the table, bringing my face inches from hers. I bought your debt. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. The bank does not own this house. The collection agency does not own this house. I own this house. And you, Evelyn, are currently 3 months behind on your rent. The silence in the dining room was absolute. It was a complete, devastating psychological annihilation. Evelyn's mouth opened and closed silently, her brain completely unable to process the magnitude of the power shift. She wasn't just exposed, she was legally conquered. The daughter she had treated like dirt, the daughter she had publicly humiliated at a picnic, was now her landlord. She had threatened to cut off an inheritance that didn't exist, from a house she no longer owned, to a daughter who held the keys to her literal survival. My father, Arthur, put his face in his hands and began to weep quietly. Aunt Martha slowly backed away from the table, looking at Evelyn as if she were a toxic, infectious disease. I looked around the room, taking in the absolute destruction of the abusers who had tormented me for 34 years. I didn't feel the need to yell. I didn't need to gloat. The cold, hard legal documents spoke entirely for themselves. I picked up my purse, zipped it shut, and looked at Evelyn one last time. You have 30 days to decide if you want to sign a formal lease agreement and pay me market rate rent, or if you want me to proceed with a formal eviction, I said smoothly. I will expect your answer through my lawyer. Happy Thanksgiving, everyone. I turned my back on the absolute chaos, walked out the heavy oak door, and stepped into the cool, refreshing autumn air. I had never felt more free in my entire life. The fallout from that Thanksgiving dinner was swift, brutal, and utterly comprehensive. When you build your entire life on a foundation of lies and manipulation, it only takes one strong gust of truth to bring the whole structure crashing down. The days following my departure from the house were a masterclass in watching karma deliver its absolute worst. I didn't hear from Evelyn directly, but in a family as dramatic as mine, news travels faster than light. Chloe's carefully curated world was the first to completely implode. Her fiancé, a wealthy investment banker named Marcus, had been sitting at the far end of the Thanksgiving table. When he heard the undeniable truth about her massive debts and her fraudulent business, he didn't even wait for the weekend to end. Marcus packed his bags, called off the lavish wedding they had planned, and completely broke off the engagement. Without his income, Chloe could no longer afford her upscale luxury apartment. The leasing company for her Porsche repossessed the vehicle directly from her office parking lot in broad daylight. The golden child, stripped of her stolen wealth, was forced to quietly move into a cheap, cramped studio apartment on the outskirts of the city. Evelyn's social destruction was equally severe. Aunt Martha, furious at being called an idiot and disgusted by the financial deceit, went on a relentless crusade. She called every single relative, every church member, and every woman at Evelyn's precious country club to relay the exact details of the Thanksgiving massacre. Evelyn was completely shunned. Women she had played tennis with for a decade suddenly stopped returning her calls. The country club quietly asked her to step down from the event planning committee. Her reputation, the only currency she truly valued, was entirely bankrupt. My phone, which had previously been a toxic dumping ground for abusive text messages, suddenly started ringing with pathetic apologies. Aunt Martha left a rambling, tearful voicemail apologizing for ever doubting me and begging me to come to her house for Christmas. Uncle Vance sent an awkward text saying he always knew Chloe was trouble. I listened to the voicemails with a cold, detached satisfaction, and then I deleted them. I did not return a single call. I was not interested in their fake apologies now that I held the position of power. They hadn't changed, they just realized they had backed the wrong horse. I blocked their numbers and focused entirely on my own peace. The justice was absolute, and I didn't need to lift another finger to watch the universe balance the scales. Exactly 1 week after Thanksgiving, I was sitting at my kitchen island drinking a cup of coffee when there was a hesitant, quiet knock at my front door. I looked through the peephole and saw my father, Arthur. He looked like he had aged 10 years and 7 days. He was wearing his old, faded fishing hat, and his shoulders were slumped as if he were carrying the weight of the entire world. In his hands, he held a small bakery box containing the cinnamon pastries I used to love when I was a little girl. I unlocked the door and let him in. He walked into my kitchen, set the bakery box gently on the granite counter, and took off his hat. He didn't try to make excuses. He didn't try to defend Evelyn. This man, who had spent 34 years silently staring at his shoes while his wife terrorized his children, sat down on one of my bar stools, put his face in his rough, calloused hands, and began to sob uncontrollably. I failed you, Arya, he wept, his voice cracking with decades of suppressed guilt. I sat at that picnic table and I heard the vile things your mother said to Leo, and I drank my beer and looked at the sky. I let her drain our accounts for Chloe because I was too terrified of the arguments. I have been a coward for 37 years, and it cost me my daughter and my grandchildren. I am so incredibly sorry. I stood there, watching my father cry real, agonizing tears. I didn't feel the burning anger I felt for Evelyn. I just felt a deep, profound sorrow for a man who had traded his backbone for a miserable, toxic peace. I placed my hand gently on his shaking shoulder. Dad, I never needed you to be a perfect hero, I told him softly. I just needed you to stand up for me once. He looked up, wiping his face with the back of his hand. He told me that after I left the Thanksgiving dinner, he finally found his voice. He had packed 2 suitcases, walked into the master bedroom, and delivered a devastating ultimatum to Evelyn. He told her that he was filing for a legal divorce the very next morning unless she agreed to seek intense, professional therapy and do exactly whatever it took to make amends with me and the grandchildren. The threat of public divorce, the ultimate scandal, had finally broken through Evelyn's narcissistic armor. He was finally standing up, but I knew that the boundaries I had built were permanent. I forgave him in that kitchen, but the dynamic of our relationship had permanently shifted. 2 weeks later, Evelyn finally met my absolute, non-negotiable condition. She drove to my house on a cold Tuesday evening. She did not wear her pearls or her cashmere. She wore a simple sweater and jeans, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. In her hands, she carried a bouquet of bright yellow tulips, my favorite flower, a detail I honestly didn't think she even remembered. I let her inside. Maya was sitting at the kitchen table doing her algebra homework, and Leo was sitting on the living room rug, building a massive tower out of colorful plastic blocks. Evelyn walked slowly into the living room. She didn't demand attention. She didn't act like the matriarch holding court. She slowly lowered herself down onto the carpet, wincing slightly as her bad knees hit the floor, until she was sitting right at eye level with my 6-year-old son. Leo stopped building his tower. He looked at her cautiously, his big brown eyes wide with uncertainty. He remembered the picnic. He remembered the rejection. Evelyn's lower lip trembled. Tears began to stream down her face, not the fake, theatrical tears she used to manipulate crowds, but real, ugly, heartbroken tears that made her shoulders physically shake. Leo, she whispered, her voice completely broken. Grandma needs to tell you something very important. What I said at the picnic a few months ago was incredibly wrong, and it was terribly mean. You did absolutely nothing wrong. You are a wonderful, perfect boy. You are my grandson, I love you very much, and I am so sorry. I watched my son process her words. He looked at her tears for a long, quiet moment. Then, with the absolute, pure grace that only a young child possesses, a grace that adults so often forget exists, he reached out his little hand and patted her arm. It's okay, Grandma, Leo said softly. He picked up a green plastic triceratops and held it out to her. Do you want to see my new dinosaur? Evelyn let out a choked sob, pulled him gently into a hug, and cried into his shoulder. She looked over at Maya and offered a deep, sincere apology to her as well, acknowledging Maya's bravery. She apologized to me for the years of financial and emotional abuse. It wasn't a magic wand that instantly erased 34 years of trauma, but for the very first time in my life, I was looking at a mother who was actually experiencing genuine remorse. The narcissistic collapse was complete, and the rebuilding could finally, cautiously begin. Today, the dust has finally settled, and my life looks completely different. I did not evict my parents. I am not a monster. Through Mr. Sterling, we drew up a strict, legally binding lease agreement. Evelyn and Arthur rent the house from me at a manageable, market-adjusted rate. If the plumbing breaks, they call a repairman, not my personal cell phone. I am no longer their daughter ATM, I am their landlord. Evelyn actually started attending weekly therapy sessions, And while she is far from perfect, the toxic, manipulative comments have entirely ceased. Arthur has taken a part-time job at a local hardware store, and he actually looks happier and more relaxed than he has in a decade. Chloe is still struggling in her tiny apartment, trying to figure out how to live without a safety net. We don't speak often, but that is a boundary I am perfectly comfortable with. My salary, my savings, and my investments are now entirely dedicated to my own family, to Maya's future college fund and Leo's happiness. I successfully broke the generational curse, and I did it not by screaming or throwing plates, but by quietly securing my own unshakable power. To anyone listening to this who feels trapped in a toxic family dynamic, to anyone who is constantly giving and only receiving pain in return, please hear me. Family is supposed to be a safe harbor, not a financial and emotional prison. You are allowed to stop writing the checks. You are allowed to demand respect. Forgiveness is a beautiful thing, but forgiveness does not mean you have to allow people to continue hurting you. You can forgive someone from a distance. You can love someone while holding a legally binding contract that protects your peace. Have you ever faced something similar with your own family? Have you ever had to draw a brutal line in the sand to protect your own children from the people who were supposed to love them? Please, share your story in the comments below. I read every single one, and your courage might be the exact thing someone else needs to hear today. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next journey of healing and taking back control. Remember, you are stronger than the guilt they try to put on you.